Hi everyone, my name is Milan and welcome to part 2 of the permission authorization series. If you missed part 1, make sure that you watch it first because it's going to be necessary for you to be able to follow this video. In this video we're going to configure our roles and permissions, and I'm going to show you how we can seed the initial values for the roles and permissions using Entity Framework migrations. So let's see how we can actually implement this. In the previous video, I showed you how we can create a custom authorization attribute which we called has permission, and we define an enum that is going to contain the permissions that we're going to use inside of the application. Now we need a way to connect the permissions to the members that are actually accessing our API. The simplest way to achieve that is going to be by defining the role and permission entities inside of our domain project. So this is the approach that we're going to take. So let's first add the role inside of the entities folder. I'm going to make the role class inherit from the enumeration class, which I showed in a previous video. To do that, I need to make role inherit from the enumeration class, and we need to specify the role as the generic argument. If you didn't watch that video where I talked about the smart enum implementation using the enumeration class, you can do that now by clicking the link that's going to pop up on the screen right now. If you watched that video, you know that we first need to define a constructor for creating a role, and it has only two arguments, the ID of the role and the name. And we need to pass both values to our base constructor of the enumeration class. And now I'm going to use that constructor to define my actual role. To create an enumeration value, I'm going to create a static read-only field of role, and I'm going to name it registered because this is the name of the role that I want to define in my project. And I'm going to create a new instance with the ID of 1, and let's make the name just registered. So this is going to be the only role that I want to define in the application. Let's go ahead and add an entity for the permission. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. If you recall, we also have an enum with the same name, but we're going to be using this class so that we can create a table in our database that is going to hold our permissions. I want this class to be very simple, so I'm just going to create a public ID property, and I'm going to give it an init setter. And I'm also going to create another property that is going to hold the permission name, and I can even assign it a value of an empty string. And we're going to use this class to define an entity with Entity Framework that is going to hold our actual permissions. Let's add some navigation properties to make our life easier. I'll go to the role class, and I'm going to add two navigation properties here. I'm going to create an iCollection property here that is going to hold the permissions that are assigned to this role. I'm also going to add another navigation property that is going to point to our members, and with this property we can configure which members belong to which role. And because we have the other navigation property to the permissions, we can define which role contains which permission. So it's kind of a hierarchy. We have the members on top, they belong to some roles, and then the roles define the permissions. So using this hierarchy, we can figure out which member has access to which permission, and that is going to tell us which endpoints this member can access. So let's go to the persistence project and add the configurations for our new entities. First, I'm going to add the role configuration. It has to inherit from entity type configuration. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And we need to specify role as the generic argument and implement this interface. All it has is a configure method, and now I can configure my role entity. I'm going to say that it has a key of ID, and I can also configure the two navigation properties that I added. I can say builder has many, and I'm going to specify that it has many, for example, first permissions. A single permission can belong to more than one role, so I'm also going to say with many, and this is enough to configure this relationship. I can also do the same for the members, so I'm going to say builder has many and specify the members here. And I'm also going to say that a member can belong to more than one role. This is going to tell Entity Framework to define a join table between our members and our roles, and also between our roles and our permissions. So we have a very flexible system to extend as we need. Also, let's seed the initial values for the permissions. To do that, I'm going to say builder has data, and I need to specify an IEnumerable of roles. And how I can do that is access the role class and call the static getValues method, which is going to return an array of all the defined roles. This method is defined in the base enumeration class, and I suggest that you watch the video about enumerations to see how we can actually implement this. And lastly, let's configure the name for the roles table. I'm going to say builder to table, and I'm going to use the table names class, and I'm going to choose the roles as the name of this table. Let's do the same for our permissions. So I'm going to add another class that is going to represent the permission configuration. Again, I'm going to inherit from the iEntityType configuration interface, and I'm going to implement it to configure our permission entity. So I'm going to specify permission here, and we're going to use the permission from our domain layer. Let's configure in similar fashion as we did with the role configuration. So I'm going to start off with the call of toTable here. I'm going to specify the table names, and I'm going to access the permissions constant and set that as the name for our table. For the key, I'm going to use the ID of the permission. We don't have any navigation properties on the permission entity, but we do have to seed the initial values for the permissions. We can use the permission enum in the infrastructure project to access these enum values, and then we can use it to seed the permission entity values. However, we have a slight problem. The permission enum is defined in the infrastructure project. The infrastructure project also references the persistence project. So we can't access this enum from the persistence project because that would introduce a circular dependency and our code wouldn't compile. So I'm going to take this enum and I'm going to move it in the enums folder in the domain project. I'm going to fix the namespace here, and let's see if everything is still building now, because we have a permission class and also a permission enum at the same time. So everything compiles, and let's go back to our permission configuration and complete seeding our permissions. So how we can do that is by accessing the enum class, and we can call the getValues method on it, and I can specify the permission enum here, and I can get back all of the values of this enum, and then I can chain a call to select, and for each value of the permission enum I can create a new instance of the permission entity. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say new permission, and I need to set the ID and the name of our permission. So for the ID, I'm just going to cast the permission enum into an integer, and for the name, I'm just going to call toString on the permission enum instance. So I'm going to say here toString, and now I have an IEnumerable of permission instances that I can use to seed the initial permissions. I'm going to make the permissions type explicit, and let's go ahead and seed the permissions. I'm going to say builder has data, and I can specify the collection of permissions, and this is going to take care of seeding the permission values with Entity Framework migrations. Lastly, we want to be able to configure which role has access to which permissions. So to be able to do that, I'm going to add another entity just for simplicity's sake. I'm going to call this entity RolePermission. This class is going to represent the join table between the roles and the permissions tables. All I want to do here is just define the compound key, and for that I'm going to use the role ID and the permission ID. So let's go ahead and add that. So permission ID, and let's add the entity configuration for this entity. I'm going to add another class here. I'm going to say role permission configuration. We need to make it inherit from the iEntity configuration interface, and we need to specify the role permission entity as the generic argument here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to move it into a new role to make it easier to read, and let's implement this interface. I want to define a composite key here, so I'm going to say has key, and to define a composite key with Entity Framework, you just need to return a new object here that is going to contain the values for your composite key, and we want to use the role ID and the permission ID as our composite key, because we don't want to allow one role to have the same permission multiple times. Before I tackle seeding the roles and permissions, let's go back to our role configuration, and here where we are configuring the navigation property to the permissions, we need to tell it to use our new role permission entity as the join entity here. So I'm going to say using entity role permission, and this is everything that we need. And now we can go to our role permission configuration and add the logic for seeding the roles and permissions. I'm going to create a simple helper method here. It's going to be a private static method, and it's going to return a new instance of our role permission entity. Let's give it a name of create, and I want it to have two arguments. The first argument is going to be the role that we are going to specify for this role permission instance, and the second argument is going to be the permission enum that we're going to use for this role permission instance. And let's return a new instance of a role permission class. We're going to set the role ID to come from our role ID property, and for the permission ID I'm just going to cast the permission value into an integer, because this is the same value that we are using for the key when we are seeding the permission entity. And now we can call builder has data, and we have an overload here that accepts an array of role permission. So I'm just going to call the create method to define a new role permission instance, and this is going to call the proper overload. So for the role, I'm just going to specify the register role, and for the permissions we have only one at the moment, which is going to be the read member permission. Let's for example add another permission here. We have the read member, so let's add the update member permission, which is going to have a value of 2. To seed our new permission, we would just add a call here to create, and we would use the register role for example, and let's use the update member permission. So this is how you can configure which roles have access to which permissions from your code, and then you can apply these changes by creating a new entity framework migration. I'm going to show you how that looks like. So let me add a migration here. I'm going to say add migration, add roles and permissions, and this is going to take care of creating our migration. Now this migration is going to be relatively big because we are adding the roles, the permissions table, all of the join tables, and we are also seeding the initial values. Let's try to make sense of this migration. Here is the create table command for creating the permissions table. Here we are creating the roles table. And let me go down here to show you something. This is where we have our seed logic applied. You can see that it correctly inserts our permissions with the proper keys and the proper names. It also adds the role that we have, which is the register role. It uses the ID from the role enumeration and the appropriate name. And this is where we define the connection between our roles and permissions. So in the future, when you add new roles and permissions, you are going to be able to seed the additional values by creating new migrations. I hope that you were able to follow along in this video, because it was a necessary step before we could tackle the actual implementation of our authorization. So in the next video, I'm going to show you how you can implement a custom authorization handler and properly apply our permission authorization logic on our endpoints. In the meantime, take a look at these two videos that you can see on the screen, and until next time, stay awesome.